You have been lied to, not occasionally, not by accident, not by isolated people with isolated agendas, systematically, by every institution that shaped you, by every authority that earned your compliance, by every relationship that benefited from you believing things about the world and about yourself that were not entirely true. And the fear of the quiet, persistent background fear that something is wrong, but you cannot name exactly what that fear is not a symptom of weakness. It is the correct response to living inside a system built on lies. One man understood this with a clarity no one else in the room was willing to claim. They put him in a cell and called him the villain. Today we are going to examine exactly what he understood, and exactly why the world needed him to be wrong, and could not survive the fact that he was not. Stay. Every second of this is going to cost you something, and every second is worth it. Every functional society without exception, across all of recorded history, operates through two foundational mechanisms. The first is force, the capacity to compel behavior through the credible threat of consequence. Law, enforcement, punishment, the visible machinery of control that operates in the open, that justifies itself through the language of order and protection. The second is narrative, the set of stories a society tells about itself, about its purpose, its fairness, its legitimacy that make force unnecessary for the vast majority of its members. The vast majority of the time, because a society that had to rely entirely on force would be exhausting you to maintain, immediately recognizable as tyranny, and perpetually vulnerable to the moment its members calculated that resistance was worth the cost. The narrative solves this problem. If you can make the people inside the system believe that the system is good, that it is fair, that it rewards what it claims to reward, that it protects what it claims to protect, then most of them will comply voluntarily, will internalize the system's values, will enforce its norms on each other, without requiring any institutional intervention at all. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a radical proposition. It is the foundational insight of every political philosopher from Plato to Gramsci. It is the operational premise of every institution of authority that has ever existed. What Heath Ledger's Joker does across every scene of The Dark Knight is expose both mechanisms simultaneously. He demonstrates, with the precision of a controlled experiment, that the narrative is false, and he reveals, by doing so, how much of the force was always there waiting, just beneath the surface, for the narrative to fail. The world runs on lies and fear. He was right, and in the next 20 minutes we are going to prove it. Let us start at the beginning, not with Gotham, not with the Joker. With you. You were born into a world that already had a story prepared for you. A story about how it worked, what it rewarded, what it required, what was possible for someone like you, in a place like this, under the conditions that existed when you arrived. That story was not neutral. It was told to you by people who had a stake in you believing it. Parents, teachers, institutions, authority figures, all of them, not necessarily with malice, transmitting a version of reality that had been inherited, shaped, and refined over generations to produce a particular kind of person. Compliant, productive, appropriately ambitious enough to participate enthusiastically in the system, but not so ambitious as to question the system's fundamental premises. Capable of tolerating significant personal cost in exchange for the promise of future reward. A promise that was always slightly out of reach, always contingent on one more sacrifice, one more demonstration of loyalty, one more deferred gratification, and most importantly, genuinely unable to identify the difference between what they were told was true and what was actually true. Because of that distinction, the ability to hold those two things separately, to examine the narrative against the reality, rather than simply accepting the narrative as the reality, that ability was the one most carefully discouraged. Not through overt censorship, through something far more effective, through the social cost of raising it. The child who asks why the rule exists rather than simply following it is difficult, disruptive, a problem to be managed back into compliance. The adult who points out the gap between the institution's stated values and its actual behavior is cynical, negative, ungrateful, not a team player. The person who refuses to perform enthusiasm for arrangements, they find genuinely problematic is difficult, challenging. Someone to be isolated from the people who have decided that maintaining the comfort of the fiction is more important than engaging with the reality beneath it. The Joker describes this dynamic with devastating simplicity. He says, "Nobody panics when things go according to plan, even if the plan is horrifying. The plan of the accepted story is maintained not because it is accurate, not because it is familiar, because the alternative, the discomfort of examining what is actually true, is a cost that most people have decided, consciously or not, they are not willing to pay." And so, the lie continues, inherited, reinforced, transmitted to the next generation with the full authority of everything that came before it. Not because anyone is orchestrating it, because everyone is participating in it, including, and this is the part that costs something to hear you, fear is the most efficient management tool ever developed, more efficient than incentive, more durable than loyalty, more scalable than any physical infrastructure of control ever built, because fear operates from the inside. Once a person has internalized a sufficient set of fears of failure, of rejection, of social exclusion, of being seen as difficult or ungrateful, or too much, they become, in the most meaningful sense, self-governing. They do not need to be watched. They do not need to be threatened. They police themselves. They police each other. The system does not need to enforce compliance. The people inside it enforce compliance on the system's behalf automatically, voluntarily, with complete sincerity. The Joker understands this with a precision that is almost academic. He tells Batman in the interrogation room, the most psychologically dense scene in the film, "You have nothing. Nothing to threaten me with. Nothing to do with all your strength." Batman's power, like all institutional power, depends entirely on having something to threaten, something the other person values enough that the threat of its removal produces compliance. The Joker has removed everything from that category, not because he is reckless, not because he does not feel, because he has made a deliberate reasoned decision to stop allowing the things that can be taken from him to govern his decisions. Now apply this to your own life with the same precision. What governs your decisions? Not your stated values, not your conscious intentions, not the version of yourself you present in conversations about who you are and what you believe. What actually governs your behavior in the specific moments when your values and your fears are in direct conflict? The fear of what your colleagues will think if you say what you actually believe in the meeting. The fear of what will happen to the relationship if you hold the boundary, needs holding. The fear of what it means about you, your worth, your capability, your right to occupy the space you currently occupy, if you fail at the thing you have decided to try. These fears are not irrational. They are not weaknesses. They are the precise, calibrated product of a system that spent years identifying exactly what you value and making clear, through countless small signals and social consequences, that those things can be made contingent on your compliance, your relationships, your professional standing, your sense of belonging in the communities you have invested in, your self-image as a good, reasonable, cooperative person. All of it subtly, consistently made to feel conditional on behaving in ways the system finds useful. That is the architecture of fear, not bars, not guards, not any visible mechanism of enforcement. Just the internalized certainty that stepping out of line will cost you something you cannot afford to lose. And the fact that you are never entirely sure, which is, of course, the point, whether that certainty is accurate. I want you to do something, not a thought experiment, an actual accounting. I want you to think about the things you have not said, not minor omissions, the significant ones, the honest assessments you kept to yourself because the cost of expressing them felt too high, the disagreements you swallowed, the boundaries you decided not to enforce because the conflict they would have produced seemed more expensive than the ongoing cost of their absence. How many of those are there? Now, think about the things you have agreed to professionally, personally, relationally that you did not actually agree with, that you complied, not because you found them genuinely acceptable, but because the alternative, the conflict, the consequence, the social cost of refusal felt too significant to absorb. Add those to the accounting. Now, think about the version of yourself you present in different contexts, at work, with family, In social environments where the stakes of being genuinely seen rather than strategically presented feel too high to risk, how much of what that version says and does and appears to believe is actually yours, and how much of it is a calibration, a continuous, largely automatic adjustment of your presentation to match what you have assessed the room requires in order to receive you without significant friction. The Joker says something in the film that is almost never quoted in this context. He asks Batman, "Why so serious?" It is read as mockery, as the taunt of a man who has abandoned all gravity. Read it differently. He is asking with genuine curiosity and a kind of dark compassion, why do you carry the weight of a performance that is costing you this much? Why do you maintain it with such intensity? What are you protecting, and is it worth what the protection is costing you? Because the performance is serious work, continuous, exhausting, identity-consuming work, and the things it protects, the approval, the belonging, the self-image contingent on being seen in a particular way, are never quite as solid as the effort invested in securing them would suggest. The lie the world runs on is not just the institutional lie, not just the narrative of systems, it is an intimate lie. The one you tell yourself every day about why the performance is necessary, why the costs are acceptable, why the version of yourself you present to the world is close enough to the real thing that the distinction does not matter. It matters. The Joker's origin, however it is told, across whatever version of the story, always involves a person who paid an enormous price believing the lie, who gave what the system required, who maintained the performance, who accepted the terms, and who discovered, at the worst possible moment, that the terms were never binding on anyone but him. That discovery arrived with everything already spent, with no reserves remaining, with every investment already made in a premise that had just been revealed as false. That is the push. Madness is like gravity. All it takes is a little push. He was not describing insanity. He was describing the precise catastrophic moment when the accounting comes due, and the balance is not what you were promised. At every point in this conversation, there has been an implicit question sitting underneath the analysis. What do you actually do with this? If the world runs on lies and fear, if the systems you operate inside are sustained by narratives that do not accurately describe reality, and by the internalized fears of the people inside them, what is the appropriate response? There are three responses most people settle into. The first is denial, the return to the comfortable fiction. The decision is usually made without fully examining it as a decision that seeing clearly is too costly, and that the managed performance is preferable to the alternative. This response is understandable. It is not without logic. The performance does provide something. The belonging, however conditional, is real belonging. The approval, however earned through suppression, is real approval. But it is a response with a compounding cost. Every year of continued performance is a year of diminishing contact with the real version of yourself. A year of increasing distance between what you actually think and what you have decided it is safe to appear to think. The second response is the Joker's response, the complete, public, theatrical rejection of every norm, every performance, every managed fiction simultaneously and without discrimination. This response has the virtue of honesty. It refuses to lie entirely, but it also refuses the distinctions that matter. Not everything in the system is a lie. Not every performance is a suppression of something real. Not every norm is a tool of control. Some of them are genuine, the accumulated wisdom of communities that have figured out how to treat each other with sufficient care to coexist. The Joker could not make those distinctions anymore. The push had come too late, with too little left to work with, so he burned everything, the real and the false together. The third response, the one that is available to you right now, in this moment, before the accounting is done to you, is neither of those. It is the deliberate, specific, ongoing process of identifying with honesty and without drama what in your life is real and what is performed, what costs are genuinely yours to carry, and which ones you have been absorbing on behalf of systems and people who have no corresponding obligation to you. What you actually believe versus what you have decided it is safe to believe. And then with the same deliberateness beginning to organize your life around the real rather than the performed. Not all at once, not through a single dramatic gesture of authenticity, through specific, concrete decisions. The honest response that costs something small but preserves something real. The boundary is maintained at personal inconvenience, because the alternative is a continued erosion of something that matters. The relationship invested in because it is built on something genuine, and the one quietly released because it is sustained entirely by the performance it requires. The Joker calls this living without rules. I would call it something more precise. Living in contact with what is actually true, and the fear of what that costs, of what it disrupts, of what it reveals about the gap between where you are and where you would be if you had been doing this all along. That fear is real, but it is smaller than the fear of arriving at the accounting unprepared, much smaller. When you stop organizing your life around the lies and the fear, when the performance begins to thin out and the real thing starts to take its place, what actually changes? The first thing that changes is perception. You begin to see people with a clarity that was previously unavailable, because your perception of them was filtered through your need for them to be a particular thing. When your sense of self is no longer dependent on their approval, when you have stopped needing them to see you in a specific way in order to maintain your own understanding of your worth, you can see them as they actually are, their genuine capacities, their actual limitations, the places where they are operating from real values and the places where they are, like everyone, performing. This is not cynicism. It is not the decision to distrust everyone. It is the ability to see people accurately, which is, paradoxically, the prerequisite for genuine connection with any of them. You cannot genuinely connect with the performance of a person. You can only connect with what is actually there. And finding out what is actually there requires being willing to show what is actually there in yourself, which requires having stopped performing long enough to know what that is. The second thing that changes is your relationship to failure. In a life organized around performance, around managing perception and maintaining approval, failure is catastrophic, not because of what it actually costs in terms of material consequences, because of what it does to the narrative, what it reveals to the people whose assessment of you, the entire structure of your self-worth, has been made contingent on. When the performance is no longer load-bearing, when your sense of what you are worth is no longer primarily a function of how you perceive failure, becomes something different. It becomes information, specific, useful, sometimes uncomfortable information about the gap between your current capabilities and what the attempt required. That gap is not a verdict on your worth. It is a map. It tells you exactly where the work is. And a person who can look at failure as a map rather than as a judgment can use it in a way that a person still organized around the performance simply cannot. The third thing that changes, and this is the one that takes the longest and matters most, is your relationship to yourself. The version of you that has been maintained through years of performance is not you. It is a highly refined, socially calibrated approximation of you built from the feedback of systems and people who were, in most cases, assessing you against criteria that had very little to do with your actual value as a human being. The real version, the one underneath the performance, has been present throughout. It has been generating discomfort, the quiet, persistent sense that something is not quite right, the recognition that keeps arriving however carefully it is managed back into silence. When you begin to build your life around that version, instead of making decisions from it, to speak from it, to allow it to be seen, something settles. Not comfort, not the absence of difficulty, something more durable than either of those things. The recognition that the life you are living is actually yours, not a performance of a life, not the life the system prepared for you, not the life maintained by lies you inherited and fears you internalized. Yours. The world runs on lies and fear. I have said this 3 times in this video, and each time I have watched in every room I have ever said it for the response. The response is always the same, not an argument, not evidence that the premise is wrong. Discomfort. The particular discomfort of recognizing something you have been aware of for a long time and have been working with considerable effort and ingenuity to avoid examining directly, because the examination has consequences, Once you have genuinely seen the architecture, once you have traced the lies back to their sources and mapped the fears to the mechanisms that produce them, you cannot pretend the performance is required. You can still choose it, but you cannot pretend it is not a choice. And precisely that is the truth the world cannot afford for you to know. Because a person who knows the performance is a choice is a person who might choose differently. And a system that depends on the performance of millions of people simultaneously, continuously, at significant personal cost to each of them, cannot function at scale. If enough of those people begin making different choices, the Joker understood this. He was not trying to destroy Gotham. He was trying to demonstrate at a scale impossible to ignore that the thing being defended as Gotham was not what anyone believed it was, that the civilization being protected by Batman, by the police, by every institution of order and authority in the city, was already built on the mechanisms he was simply rendering visible, and the full, panicked resource, mobilizing response of every institution in the film was not a response to the violence. Violence happened in Gotham before the Joker. It happened routinely. It was managed through the established channels. The response was to the visibility, to the fact that he was making the architecture apparent, showing the machinery behind the narrative, demonstrating, in real time, the gap between what the system claimed to be and what it actually was. That is what they could not allow, not because the machinery was secret, but because the machinery only functions as long as the people inside it believe the narrative is real. He was right about the lies, about fear, about the gap between what is claimed and what is real, about the violence already present beneath the language of order and protection, about the selectivity of the rules and the people they actually bind. His tragedy was not his perception. His perception was precise. His understanding was accurate. What he saw was real. His tragedy was that the seeing arrived with nothing intact to build from. You are not in that position. You are here at this moment with enough still standing to build something real from what you have just seen. The question is not whether the world runs on lies and fear. It does. The only question that has ever mattered is what you are going to build on the other side of knowing that. The world runs on lies and fear. Joker was right, not in every particular, not as a justification for any specific action, but in the essential structural observation that the systems organizing human life depend on narratives that do not accurately describe those systems, enforced through fears that have been carefully cultivated to keep the people inside them cooperative. That is true. And knowing it is true is the beginning of something, not comfort, not the resolution of every difficulty, not freedom from the costs of living in a world organized this way, but the specific, irreplaceable advantage of someone who can see the board clearly. If something in this video named what you have been carrying, if something here articulated what you have been aware of without quite having the language to drop a comment, tell me exactly which moment hit. I read every one of them, and I respond to more than you expect. If this deserves to be heard, share it. I like it. Subscribe with notifications. This channel is built for exactly this conversation, the one that is too honest for comfort and too necessary to avoid. The world runs on lies and fear, and the most dangerous person in any system is not the one who causes the most disruption. It is the one who has stopped being afraid of what the system can take from them. The world runs on lies and fear. The most dangerous person in any system is not the one who causes the most disruption. It is the one who has stopped being afraid of what the system can take from them. The Joker's tragedy was not his perception. His perception was precise. His tragedy was that the seeing arrived with nothing intact left to build from. You still have something to build with. Once you know the performance is a choice, you cannot pretend it is not. And a person who knows that might choose differently. That is exactly what the system cannot afford.